Hello, my name is Jay. I am half Palestinian and half English. I am very, very lucky to be recording this video from Edinburgh in Scotland. If you are watching this around the time that it comes out, there is a small chance you've heard next to nothing about what is happening in Palestine at this moment. But it is much, much more likely that you are inundated with the same barrage of horror, betrayal, confusion, and verbal poison as me, in which case no one could expect you to pay more attention to this video than to any of the others. If there is one thing, though, that I hope you take away from this, whether you believe it or not, because let's face it, the bar of expectations for believing Palestinians is set very, very low, is this. Palestinians were never able to choose peace. The peace wanted by everyone affected in this ongoing genocide is not the same peace promoted by politicians, world leaders, the media, and very often people we know personally, but it is that version of peace, internationalized by the Oslo and Camp David Accords, that rules, no matter how much you may want the bloodshed to stop. And it is a cornerstone of the slaughter, both of Palestinians and Israelis, that you are watching unfold right now, supported by every major power that claims to want peace and democracy. This video draws very heavily on a piece of work by the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, which examines the origins of what is called the peace process between Israel and Palestine, drawing on historical documents, speeches, and the minutes of government meetings, all kept by the Central Zionist Archives, Israel's state archives, and from a memoir of one of the individuals involved in the process alongside other historical and academic publications. Pappé traces how current mainstream narratives of peace and a two-state solution were developed as an essential part of the Zionist ambition to gain as much as possible of Palestine, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. He doesn't do any artful interpretation or reading between the lines. He is presenting what was often an explicitly stated plan. In 1963, 4 years before Israel's occupation of Palestine began, Israel's military was preparing the administration that would rule the lives of 1 million Palestinians. The West Bank was split into 8 districts of military control, under what was called the Shaham Plan, or officially, Organization of Military Rule in the Occupied Territories. The plan was first worked out among members of the military administration running the areas in which the 1948 Palestinians lived under strict rule that robbed them of most of their basic rights, and which by 1967 had been going for 20 years, as well as officers in the legal section of the Israeli army, officials in the Ministry of Interior, and 1 or 2 private lawyers. At this stage, their efforts were focused around tailoring laws developed under the British Mandate and Jordanian rule, which covered Jews and non-Jews, so that these rules only governed Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which were expected in 1963 to be under continued military rule, as they had been since 1948. Settlers, as they arrived in the West Bank, would be exempt from these laws. Jordanian laws were preserved almost entirely. However, any law that went against Israel and would have the same weight as Israeli law in these occupied territories was scrapped, where the mandate terms of High Commissioner and His Majesty's government were written, they were replaced with Military Governor and the Israel Defense Forces, respectively. International law and the Geneva Convention were explicitly discussed, and the fact that the Geneva Convention forbade execution was one of the main concerns. The plan is personally attested to in the memoir of Zvi Inbar, a participant in the planning. Directly after the 1967 war, the project of these had moved from their relatively small circle to the 13th government of Israel, which Pappé calls the widest possible Zionist consensus, as every possible ideological stream was present. That's socialists, revisionists, the labor Zionist movement, the most secular, liberal, and most religious and ultra-religious political parties never before nor after this government's term in office would such a consensual partnership lead the state of Israel in its decisions. Despite political differences, all of these groups came together to agree on how to deal with the ghettos of Gaza and the West Bank. The overall result of each of these policies was life imprisonment for those populations, without any crimes defined or admitted to. I should make a note here that what you, the viewer, understand by Zionism and what I understand by Zionism may be substantially different. There are specific terms used in different circles. Some say that Zionism, as the intense yearning for a return home after millennia of victimization, is different from what they call neo-Zionism, that is, the political manifestation of that desire in the colonial project of the State of Israel. I am not educated on these terms, but it is important to note that there is not one definition of Zionism. What is most important to me here is Pappé's argument, where he simply states that the outcomes of the 1967 talks were the inevitable outcome of Zionist ideology and history, however you choose to define its many shades. Aside from that, in this situation and anywhere else, how we as human individuals define our stances in relation to others around us is just as holy, and in a sense just as authoritative as anything sanctioned by people who claim some kind of power over us. Now, even though many of the parties in these talks went on to differ on a range of issues, their decisions became a foundational element of the collective self-definition of the Zionist project. Whatever their differences before or since, no Israeli government has deviated from the policy of imprisonment. Until now. The nature of this unique consensus was that no matter ideological, political, or religious differences, any challenge to the actions of any government since the 13th can only effectively hold them accountable for the path we are on, if the validity of Zionism itself is questioned. Now, in a sense, this path they chose was actually Plan B. The military officials, legal officers, interior officials, and lawyers were faced with a problem: a democratic state that has a policy of expansion into lands that are not theirs, regardless of their beliefs, is not a democratic state. Yet the State of Israel, as projected by its 13th government, needed to take as much of the land of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. The question was how to do this while maintaining the veneer of a democratic state on the global stage. It wasn't as if they were seeking to behave democratically. Military occupation was explicitly planned. A year after the Shaham Plan was developed in 1964, governors and judges began to be appointed for the areas to be taken over in 1967. Each governor received information packages for governing, copies of the Geneva Conventions and other human rights treaties, and the British Mandate's emergency regulations, which were laws that allowed establishing military tribunals to try civilians without granting the right of appeal, allowing sweeping searches and seizures, prohibiting publication of books and newspapers, demolishing houses, detaining individuals administratively for an indefinite period, sealing off particular territories, and imposing curfew. And that, then, served as the authority for Israel to demolish and seal hundreds of houses, deport residents, administratively detain thousands of persons, and impose closures and curfews on towns and villages. Along with these were sent a series of books prepared either directly before the occupation of Germany or based on lessons learned from that occupation. Studies had also been made in 1963 of Israel's previous military rule in Sinai, Egypt, in Gaza, and within Israel, and the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem and the cleansing and destruction of scores of villages in 1948, called the Yavusi Operation. Now, I must be absolutely clear that I am not equating Zionism as a colonial project to Nazism. But it is clear from historical records kept by Israel and Israelis that these projects at specific moments were willing to use the same tools. And look at the tools Israel is using now. 6,000 bombs dropped in 6 days. The dropping of white phosphorus against international law in Gaza and in Lebanon, and the purchase by the National Security Ministry of 10,000 assault rifles with helmets and body armor to give to settler militias in the West Bank to do with what they like. And that's nearly 60 years after choosing Plan B. So why did they choose it? Because after those 4 years of planning, that was what was made available as a solution to their dilemma, by the particular arrangement of global and regional power and knowledge that Palestinian and Jewish communities were then caught up with and participating in, with the United States, the EU, Russia, the United Nations, and most Arab states, along with Palestine's Fatah, the Zionist left and center in Israel, and some well-known figures in the Palestinian Solidarity movement. Gaza and the West Bank as we know them today, this minute, were intentionally designed as 2 prisons. Members of Israel's 13th government were convinced that they had found the formula that would enable Israel to keep the territories it coveted without annexing the people it negated, while safeguarding international immunity and reputation. That is, immunity and reputation on the global stage before world powers. Military rule had by 1967 been imposed on Palestinians for 18 years, and in that time our population grew. Then, as now, it was understood and repeated that the state of Israel could not exist as envisioned if, with all the legal boundaries that make up Israel, Jews were a minority. And while Palestinians living within Israeli territory did not threaten that population balance, the population of Gaza and the West Bank, which had increased over 18 years, would have tipped the scale, making Israelis a minority. The need, therefore, was to keep the territories without expelling the people in them, but also without granting them citizenship. Israeli citizenship would make them part of the state. This was, and has remained until now, the foundation of the practical, pragmatic running of the Zionist project on the ground, as supported by that great consensus. Now, it has to be understood that while in isolation, simply denying Palestinians citizenship to the State of Israel may seem compatible with peace between the 2 sides, if we look at the living conditions of Palestinians then and now, calls for peace were only ever a disguise for the continued colonization of Palestinian land, and only ever an excuse for any accompanying bloodshed, so long as it is the state of Israel shedding blood, or settlers. To refuse people citizenship is to refuse them the rights that are afforded to citizens. Only one known human invention similarly deprives people of the basic human and civil rights of citizens: the modern-day prison. The prison, the penitentiary institution, and correctional facilities are modern projects that impose such a reality either as part of a ruthless dictatorship or as a consequence of a long legal process in democracies. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are forced to stare at their guards and murderers at checkpoints, between the links in barbed wire fences, like the one we saw being bulldozed 1 week ago. They are forced to see a vast concrete wall and to stand by or be beaten or killed as their houses are stolen from them, or flattened by entire teams of bulldozers, and as their children are abducted by soldiers in the middle of the night. In 1967, a nationalist vision that could only be possible in the real world, in real terms, through colonization and ethnic cleansing, came up against a constellation of political power, and enough humans with a conscience around the decision-making tables that decision-makers opted instead to imprison, at the time, 1.5 million people. Now risen to 5 million, though that is going down right now because Palestinians are being massacred as I speak. These were not individuals guilty and convicted of specific crimes. This was an entire society being collectively punished. Could it have stayed like that? If Palestinians had just accepted their situation, could there have been peace in 1967 or since? No. The reality, that reality, was kept on life support by the stories accepted and shared by the political arrangement of the time. Every mainstream option of peace given was accepted by many of the parties named at the beginning of this video, most notably the EU, Russia, the US, and also the UN. Here are 2 reasons. First, that political climate has crumbled. Israel no longer needs to appear to be a democratic state on the global stage in order to receive aid, as it has been consistently getting since 1967, while being allowed to carry out ethnic cleansings of neighborhoods, murder, abduction, the founding of illegal settlements, the collective punishment of Gazans and West Bank residents, shelling, the cutting off of water and electricity. And those other 4 major powers, as ex-colonizers do, and as is clear from the past decades and the past few hours, first abandoned Palestinians to die, and then decided to help. At the time, Israel needed the narrative of the peace process in order to survive as a state, while the EU, Russia, the US, and the UN faced absolutely no existential threat, and had wanted to rid themselves of any responsibility in the region after World War II, and were then able to engage with the issue in the following 20-odd years totally on their terms and in their interests, claiming to support the Jewish people and seeking to atone in a way that the international community could swallow for the vile neglect, abandonment, and betrayal of the Jewish people, up to and during the genocide that was the Holocaust. Israel as a state, and this is a personal take, is now on a similar level to those states. Not one of the most powerful countries involved, be it Israel or those sending Israel arms even now, like the US or other members of NATO, is in danger of annihilation, as is totally clear if we look at current political alliances and the statements being put out day by day. The second reason is that because of the administrative and military apparatus regulating the West Bank and Gaza, abusing, abducting, and murdering Palestinians, allowing settlements to be built continuously, and not even allowing the Palestinian Authority jurisdiction over and in their territories after settlers, often armed with the help of IOF forces, set up new homes within their borders, violent self-defense was always going to occur. And most importantly, this was by design. Between 1967 and 1987, what Pappé calls the softer version of imprisonment was implemented by the Israeli state, enclosing Palestinians in an open-air prison, and Palestinians resisted. Look at Israeli actions during that time and you will see why. In response, the Israeli state cracked down with a much, much harsher maximum security version of the imprisonment. Resistance continued until 1993, and Israel imposed the softer measures again. And after 7 years, Palestinians fought back again until 2009. Now here is a question you have to ask yourself. Are you going to view this as a society revolting against colonization when they were abandoned by the world? Or are you going to view it as the Arabs being unhappy with their lot? All that the peace process, as we have heard it talked about 1,000,000 times, was ever going to bring was breathing space for a Zionist project that, despite political differences, had agreed already in 1967, after 18 years of military occupation of Palestine, that their goal was to put in military ghettos the Palestinians they didn't murder. And whenever there was a chance, violate international law, expand, kill those who resisted, kill those who didn't resist, consistently implement the British Mandate's emergency laws, and claim that all this was only because Palestinians would not accept peace. And the story of peace made official on the global stage with the Oslo Accords in 1991 and Camp David Accords in 1978 either fooled enough people in the solidarity movement or in the international community who could have made a difference into doing nothing, or gave states with no interests but their own an excuse to do nothing, so long as they could pay lip service to a fantasy that someday just another ex-colony of Arabs would stop being slaughtered in kennels. Decades of occupation and lack of just international response leaves no options. Everybody affected wants peace, but the peace that has been promoted for years in academia, in politics, the media, in schools, often in daily conversation, is a lie. 84 countries are currently supporting the coming invasion and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. today, that's 3 hours gone, British time, Palestinians in southern and central Gaza are being given 2 streets down which they can evacuate safely. Reports are regularly coming in that any civilian families or groups fleeing are being shelled or shot down by military raids as they run. United Nations schools at which many have taken refuge are being shelled, meaning there are no spaces deemed safe. Hospitals are full of victims of shell attacks and are expected to move them. Israel has stated Palestinians will be able to return once they are given permission. Some are deciding to stay. And despite Hamas's claims that this is a bluff by the Israeli state, I think many of those who are staying know very well that they are going to be killed, whether they comply or not. I am absolutely terrified of the idea that there are 2 streets through which Palestinians are being given safe passage, because that means 2 things. Anyone found fleeing outside those 2 streets is dead by default. and the over 1 million people being ordered to run will be very densely concentrated in 2 easily targeted columns, and it has just been reported that the Egypt-Gaza border, which is the only exit for Gazans left, is currently closed by the Israeli military. It is being repeated everywhere that this is the fault of Hamas and the Palestinians more generally for not accepting peace. But peace was never on the table. Witness what is happening now, in full honesty with yourself. Watch yourself kindly in your moments of confusion. Remember what is happening now, and ask yourself if the systems and most basic ideas we are told from day one to trust in are anything like what we are told. Do you believe that Israel was taken by surprise and had no plan when Hamas attacked? Genocide is being carried out against Palestinians this second. Witness it. Write about it. Post about it. Make some kind of paper trail. This was always the plan. Accept nothing less.